Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really intricate look at one of the world's most complex nations, Pakistan. You know, when you read the headlines, the picture is usually one of, well, perpetual chaos, economic struggle, and this constant threat of state failure.
That's absolutely the common perception, isn't it?
Hmm.
But our mission today, really drawing deeply from the source material you've shared, is to try and look past that sort of superficial image.
Right.
You want to drill down into the internal structures, the kinship networks, these localized systems of honor, and the powerful institutions that actually give Pakistan a surprising, often overlooked internal resilience.
Yeah.
We want to understand not just what seems broken, but actually why it endures.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea right away then. The sources strongly suggest that unless there's a truly catastrophic spillover from Afghanistan, Pakistan is likely to survive as a state, which, you know, seems counterintuitive when analysts are constantly predicting its disintegration.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah. Until you really examine the historical context that's often used as a precedent for failure.
Right.
I mean, the 1971 separation of Bangladesh,
Right.
the material we looked at is very clear. The comparison is, well, it's a fundamentally poor analogy for modern Pakistan.
Explain why, though. What made 1971 so uniquely unstable that it doesn't really apply today?
Well, think about it. You had two parts of a single country separated by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory.
Yeah.
Just geographically, it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
And then you add immense cultural, linguistic, ethnic differences on top of that. The logistics of just governing that, bizarrely fractured. West Pakistan, which is basically today's Pakistan, is, by contrast, much more of a natural unity, geographically, linguistically, demographically. The country today shares borders and commonalities that just didn't exist back in that 1947 configuration. So while the problems Pakistan faces are huge, absolutely immense, the physical breakup precedent of 71, it's largely meaningless for the challenges it faces now. The resilience, therefore, it seems rooted more in geography and these deep sociological structures.
That sets the stage really well. So if the state machinery often looks weak or, you know, chaotic, the real strength must be somewhere else in society itself. Let's dive into what the sources identify as the single most important focus of loyalty. The kinship network, the biradari.
Yeah, the biradari. And what's fascinating here is how fundamentally different this structure is from, say, Western civic models. For most people, loyalty to their biradari vastly outweighs loyalty to the centralized state, to the bureaucracy. This network isn't just about family in narrow sense. It's the default mechanism for survival, for protection, for navigating politics, everything, really.
And the language itself reflects this. I found that example of Bhai Sahib, Brother Lord, so telling. It sums up this whole dynamic, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a perfect linguistic snapshot of how power actually operates on the ground, Bhai Sahib. It's a term of respect, of deference, sure. But you might use it to address someone who, on paper, is pretty menial, a bus conductor, a minor clerk, someone like that.
Right.
But they're in a position to grant you a small favor, or maybe more importantly, to block you, to cause trouble. So using that term is an immediate recognition that personal influence, relational loyalty based on kinship or patronage, it trumps formal rank, even economic status sometimes. It shows just how deeply hierarchy and relational obligation are tangled up.
So this kinship thing isn't just some quaint cultural tradition. It's actually a necessary social contract. People need these close ties for, like, practical daily survival.
Absolutely essential. Look, when the formal institutions of the state, you mentioned the police, the courts, even banks, when they're widely seen as predatory or corrupt or just totally inaccessible, your kinship network is your primary safety net. It's your security blanket.
Okay.
It provides protection against rivals, maybe against predatory or violent local police. It helps you navigate a corrupt judicial system. And critically, it's the pathway for getting political patronage, jobs, contracts, licenses. Yeah.
Your biradari is basically your insurance policy against a state that feels pretty capricious.
And this reliance is so deep that the sources detail how it even dictates major life choices,
Yeah.
specifically the prevalence of cousin marriage, not just as a cultural thing, but as a kind of economic and social statement.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Cousin marriage comes up as a critical way of honoring obligations and, crucially, maintaining social status and respectability, especially among those who aspire to or want to maintain an Ashraf lifestyle that's sort of the noble or elite ideal.
Right.
By marrying children to first cousins, families make sure that assets, information, and most importantly, political influence stay concentrated within that close network. It keeps things tight.
What's really insightful is how far this practice extends. geographically speaking.
Yeah, that really demonstrates the strength of the bond, doesn't it?
Hmm.
The source gives this example of families who've migrated, say, to East Oxford in the UK. Even there, they often still prioritize arranging marriages for their children with the children of siblings back in Pakistan.
Wow.
This practice is a very public, very critical statement that these families, even though they're separated by continents, still recognize mutual binding obligations. It reinforces their commitment to that Ashraf code of conduct and signals that their status, their izzat, hasn't been diluted by distance or by earning money abroad.
This leads us right into that paradox of modernization you mentioned. Standard theories suggest that as people urbanize, these traditional kinship bonds should weaken, right? And you'd expect modern civic structures to emerge. But the sources say urbanization has had, well, minimal impact on political patterns in Pakistan.
This is where those standard Western models just fail spectacularly. You've had this massive physical migration, huge numbers pouring into the cities. But culturally, many remain, as the source puts it, culturally peasants. They stay deeply attached to their kinship groups. Why? Because the economic environment of the city actually forces this continued dependence.
Okay, connect that to the bigger picture. Why aren't modern jobs and systems absorbing them, creating that shift?
Well, the root cause is structural economics.
Okay.
Basically, the modern formal sectors of the economy just haven't grown fast enough or large enough to actually absorb this massive influx of people.
Right.
So huge parts of the urban population remain semi-employed or in the informal economy or relying on low-wage service jobs. They just don't have the savings, the security, the benefits that formal employment is supposed to provide.
Makes sense.
Therefore, you still need your biradari for basic survival, for emergency medical funds, maybe protection from urban gangs or the police or the courts. The city, in effect, has failed to replace the basic safety net that the countryside, for all its flaws, provided through kinship.
This moves us naturally from kinship loyalty to that deep cultural concept of personal integrity and public standing. Is at honor and prestige. The sources really stress this isn't something negotiable.
No, it is arguably the most fundamental cultural currency. If a man, or by extension his family, fails to avenge a perceived insult or injury, and often this demands violence, or at least the credible threat of it, they are profoundly dishonored.
And that has real consequences.
Huge consequences. This dishonor diminishes their standing, their ability to make alliances, their political prospects, their access to patronage, everything. It's an existential crisis, really. There's that quote from Sir Cecil Walsh that "Is a man's most cherished possession after his son." That really underscores how critical it is. An entry to "Is it," whether it's real or just perceived, is something that simply cannot be forgotten or forgiven easily.
And this concept links honor directly to physical force, suggesting that at the end of the day, the ultimate decider in disputes isn't the law court, but the man with the biggest stick.
That is the unfortunate reality in many contexts. Disputes between families and clans might start in the law courts, sure, but the ultimate final decision often lies with the threat or the actual application of physical force. Local landowning families, particularly in rural areas like Sindh, they have to visibly maintain what the source calls a semblance of strength. If they're seen as weak, they're basically finished, their land becomes vulnerable, their women might be insulted, their political influence just evaporates.
So it's a constant balancing act.
It's a very delicate, ongoing calculation.
Yeah.
You have to maintain this armed strength, this reputation for capability, but you also have to carefully avoid the kind of endless, resource-draining blood feuds that would destroy your own family entirely. It's all about risk and reputation.
And this reliance on personal force and clan strength is clearly a direct reaction to the failure of the formal state, right? So it's no surprise that the state judicial system is widely seen as predatory, corrupt, and just totally unreliable.
Absolutely. The inability of the state to provide basic, swift, and fair justice is probably the single biggest factor driving local populations back towards these parallel, localized systems, or sometimes even towards radical ones. We see this so clearly in that anecdote from the Momin farmer about Taliban justice.
That quote is incredibly telling. What exactly did he say about the difference between the state courts and the Taliban?
He said, and this is pretty direct, "Taliban justice is better than that of the Pakistani state. If you have any problem, you can go to the Taliban and they will solve it without you having to pay anything, not like the courts and police, who will take your money and do nothing."
Wow.
That sentiment just captures the core frustration perfectly. The Taliban, whatever you think of their methods, offers speed, decisiveness, and crucially, zero cost. Compare that to the state, which seems to just extract resources and deliver nothing but delay and frustration.
Let's focus on the police then, the most visible arm of the state. Why is their capacity so, well, dismal, even when the government must know they're critical for stability?
Well, it really boils down to a complete failure of funding and incentives. The regular police, especially the station house officers, SHOs, and the constables on the ground, they're just abysmally paid.
Yeah.
The sources make this sharp contrast with the motorway police, who are generally seen as honest and efficient. And the reason? They're paid double the normal police wage. It's pretty
Yep.
simple.
So it's about resources, too.
Definitely. When you lack basic resources, no functional vehicles, no reliable radios, not even proper bulletproof vests, sometimes, how do you incentivize an officer to risk his life fighting militants or powerful local strongmen for barely a living wage? The system basically asks them to risk everything for next to nothing.
And when the police do investigate, they often rely on methods that are, let's say, less than scientific.
Precisely. There's this deep cultural problem, as the source puts it, within the police force regarding modern methods. When senior officers try to introduce forensics or fingerprinting or more advanced investigation techniques, the response from the ordinary SHOs on the ground is often dismissive. They see it as the hobby horse of overeducated senior officers. They prefer the method that, well, works immediately for them.
Which is the reliable method mentioned in the material.
That method, described quite bluntly by a senior officer in Punjab, is direct and brutal. Put the suspect on the mat and give him a good kicking. Then he'll tell us everything. Yeah. This reliance on torture over actual forensic evidence, it not only fails to deliver genuine justice, obviously, but it also reinforces that public perception of the police as violent and predatory. And that just drives people further away from the state system and back towards their Biradari for protection.
That lack of accountability seems really compounded by the fact that there's no jury system in Pakistani courts. Why does that tradition still persist centuries later?
Well, that absence goes right back to the British colonial system. The British consciously excluded the jury system for what the source calls obvious imperial reasons. Basically, they didn't trust the local population to deliver impartial verdicts that suited imperial interests.
Okay.
And that tradition continues today. Partly, it's due to an ingrained contempt among some of the elite legal and political class for the illiterate masses, as they might see them. But there's also a genuine, maybe pragmatic fear behind it, too. The fear is that if you actually implemented juries, they would instantly and probably violently split along lines of kinship, sect, or ethnicity. You'd inject all that social chaos directly into the formal legal process, potentially wrecking the system entirely. So it's a kind of catch-22.
So if the courts fail and force often rules, how does that chaos translate when society tries to formalize power through democracy? Let's move into Section 3 and talk about how political life actually functions under these conditions: weak administration, strong patronage.
Yeah, the sources make it pretty clear that Pakistani democracy doesn't really reflect the people in that idealized Western sense. It's more like a mirror, reflecting the existing distribution of social, economic, and political power within that society. The formal democratic process often ends up just legitimizing the local strongmen who already hold power.
And what does that mean for actual governance, for the state's ability to function?
It means that politicians, once they get elected, accrue this tremendous power of patronage and, frankly, harassment. They use this power to subject state officials, the bureaucrats, the police chiefs, the development officers, to endless pressure. Constant transfers are a key tool.
Right, moving people around so they can't get established.
Exactly. This effectively prevents any honest or competent official from gaining the local knowledge and stability needed to run their district properly. It basically cripples honest administration and efficiency at the local level. It's designed to keep power in the hands of the politician, not the administrator.
There's a stunning illustration of this in the sources, how this patronage system completely distracts even high-level state officials from their national duties. Tell us about the foreign minister's dinner.
Ah, yes. That anecdote perfectly captures this clash between the modern state and the, feudal or patronage system. The foreign minister at the time, Makhdoom Shah Mahmud Qureshi, who comes from a very prominent peer family himself.
Spiritual leader family, right?
Exactly, adding another layer of influence. Anyway, he was attending a dinner for the Multan Chamber of Commerce. As soon as his formal duties were done, he was just besieged, mobbed by local constituents.
And they weren't asking about foreign policy, I assume?
Not a bit of it. They were asking him to intervene in things like
false murder charges against their relatives, problems with loan repayments, trying to get promotions for their cousins and government jobs. Totally local, personal stuff.
So he's the foreign minister dealing with international diplomacy one minute, and the next he's essentially acting like a local ward boss sorting out police cases.
Precisely. The source notes he probably spends half his time dealing with purely local patronage issues that technically shouldn't be his business at all. But he has to intervene if these petitioners are important local figures or close relatives.
Why?
Because if he refuses, he instantly loses the local political base, the Biradari support, that's absolutely necessary for him to hold his high national office in the first place.
Wow.
The demands of local politics just overshadow national administration every single day.
And that structural reality forces the mainstream parties to make some really difficult, sometimes morally questionable choices when they're picking candidates, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. They often feel they have no choice but to adopt candidates who are, known murderers or the heads of powerful, sometimes violent clans.
Why would they do that?
Because, as the source puts it, voters themselves support them and demand that we take them. The voters respect and perhaps fear men who have danda, that means armed force, the cudgel, basically power. The voters demand that the parties nominate these individuals because these men are seen as the only ones powerful enough to actually deliver protection, patronage, and maybe even a rough kind of justice in a system where the formal state just can't or won't. So armed strength, not policy ideas, often determines who gets elected locally.
Let's pivot now to some of the regional fault lines, starting with the unique political culture of the Pathans. The sources use a pretty memorable comparison. 18th century Scots without the alcohol. What does that capture?
Yeah, it's evocative. It captures their essence, really fiercely proud, highly independent, with this deeply ingrained tradition of revolt and warfare. This makes them far less politically docile, you could say, than populations in, say, Punjab and Sindh. They're masters of resistance.
But it's a contradiction, right?
It is. Because at the same time, Pathans also draw tremendous economic and institutional advantages from being part of the Pakistani state, which is, overall, much richer than their tribal areas might be alone. So they kind of exploit the state while simultaneously resisting its complete control. It's a complex relationship.
And their political system seems defined by this need for continuous public validation, especially courage.
Yes, absolutely. Pathan society puts huge emphasis on naam, which is prestige or reputation. And a leader has to constantly renew that naam through visible acts of bravery or generosity or influence. You can't just inherit it and sit back.
And this is where the Taliban have been effective.
Frighteningly effective. This is precisely why the Pakistani Taliban have been so successful in undermining traditional authority structures there. By systematically targeting and killing local maliks, the traditional tribal elders, they literally strip the political leadership of the physical courage that is valued above almost everything else in that culture.
How so?
Well, if everyone knows a leader is terrified of the militants, that he can't protect himself or his followers, then he can't possibly hold naam. He can't be a malik in anything but name. The whole system of authority just collapses under that kind of targeted violence.
And this political life revolves around a key social institution, the Hujra. Can you explain that?
Right, the Hujra. It's really the beating heart of Pathan political and social life, especially for men in this very sexually segregated society. It functions as the men's club, the guest house, the place for debates, the audience room for the local big man.
So it's more than just a building.
Oh, much more. It's a critical space where men gather, discuss politics, forge alliances, settle disputes. The simple act of attending a particular hujra signifies allegiance or deference, or at least recognition of the big man who owns it. It reinforces the local power structure completely outside of any formal Democratic Party lines.
Now, let's shift focus dramatically to the urban spheres, specifically Karachi and the Muhajir community. Through the MQM party, they seem to represent a radical exception to this typical magnate-formed political landscape we've been discussing.
Yes, this is a really crucial distinction. The mainstream parties, the PPP, the PMLN, they were essentially founded by rural or urban magnates, big landowners, wealthy industrialists, people whose power was based on land, inherited wealth, and status. The MQM, the Mujahid Qawmi movement, was totally different. It emerged from lower middle-class students. Their origins were completely outside that traditional patronage system.
So how did the Muhajir experience being migrants from India after partition allow them to bypass that established patronage model that seems to entangle every other party?
Well, it seems like three main factors came together. First, the experience of being uprooted during partition meant they arrived in Pakistan. mainly in Karachi and other Sindh cities, without established landholdings or the deep rural birdari networks that dominated elsewhere. They basically had to create a new political order from scratch.
Okay.
Second, they generally had a stronger, more organized urban tradition compared to many other migrant groups arriving at the time. And third, they had a language advantage, because Urdu, their language, became the official national language, giving them an edge in administration and education early on.
And that combination allowed them to build something different.
Exactly. It allowed them to build a movement based more on ethnic identity, perceived grievances, and eventually a kind of urban efficiency and meritocracy, at least relative to others, rather than relying purely on inherited wealth and those rural clan loyalties.
And the sources confirm this actually translated into tangible differences in how Karachi was run.
Yes, it seems so. Karachi has obviously exploded in size and faces immense challenges, but the sources suggest it hasn't descended into the same kind of shambolic misery you see in some other major South Asian cities.
Oh.
Under MQM municipal governance, Karachi was often cited as one of the better-run large cities in the region, at least in terms of basic service delivery.
And what about corruption? The MQM certainly has a reputation there, too.
Oh, definitely. Businessmen readily acknowledge the corruption, but they consistently point out a critical difference compared to other parties.
What's that famous distinction they make?
The corruption was seen as smaller scale, more orderly, and crucially transactional. The quote you often hear is, "They take, but they deliver."
Ah.
Meaning, if you paid the necessary bribe or contribution, the job actually got done, the garbage was collected, the streetlights generally worked, permits were issued. This contrasts sharply with experiences elsewhere, where you might pay a bribe and the money just disappears into the vast patronage machine without any corresponding public service being delivered at all.
Altaf Hussein, the MQM founder, also provides a powerful contrast to dynastic leaders like the Bhuttos. His appeal is described as the charisma of the ordinary. What does that mean?
It's a really interesting and clearly highly effective form of political charisma. When the lower middle-class Mohajirs looked at Altaf Hussein, who's described as having a pretty unremarkable appearance, a high-pitched voice, they didn't see a feudal lord or a glamorous princess. They saw an exalted version of themselves.
Hmm.
He was an ordinary man who, through organization and force, achieved extraordinary power. This very ordinariness is what made him compelling and relatable to his base. It inspired this intense loyalty, this belief among his followers that he was almost divinely guided, yet still accessible. So accessible they even started calling him Pir Sahib, Master Saint, which is usually reserved for religious figures.
Okay, finally in this section, let's look at Balochistan. It's a region perpetually plagued by insurgency, fueled by deep fears over resource distribution, Gwadar port, new military bases, gas revenues. The political system there reveals a really bizarre structure designed almost purely for elite co-option.
Yeah, the mechanism of co-option described in the Balak Provincial Assembly is just extraordinary. It's almost cartoonish in its blunt pragmatism. Get this. In 2009, 62 out of the 65 members of the Provincial Assembly were actually in the provincial government.
Wait, 62 out of 65, so almost the entire legislature was part of the executive branch. How does that even work? Where's the opposition, the accountability?
Well, from a serious democratic accountability or efficient governance standpoint, yes, it looks completely crazy. But if your main goal is managing internal conflict and keeping the powerful tribal leaders on side, the source argues it's actually eminently sensible.
How so?
The purpose is entirely transactional. Every single one of those 62 co-opted government members, whether they were called a minister without portfolio, or an advisor with ministerial rank, received a hefty personal share of the provincial development budget. We're talking like Rs 50 million each to spend on projects back in their own districts.
So it's basically a massive state-funded buy-off system designed to keep the most powerful local figures happy and invested in the status quo.
Precisely. It ensures that almost all of the 80-odd tribal sardars, the traditional chiefs who hold real power locally, are financially tied to the government. This makes it much harder for them to actively join or even materially support the anti-Pakistan insurgency. It cleverly uses the state's resources to reinforce traditional tribal leadership loyalty, even if it results in wildly inefficient or corrupt administration overall.
We have to pause here, though, and contrast this kind of political maneuvering with the horrific local customs tied to honor, particularly the atrocities against women that the sources detail in Balochistan.
Yes, the sources are quite stark about this. The situation regarding violence against women in parts of Balochistan and also neighboring areas like southern Punjab is appalling,
even by Pakistan's generally conservative standards. This includes truly ghastly local practices like honor killings, where women are murdered by their own families for perceived slights against family honor.
What else?
And also the practice of vani or swara, where young girls, sometimes minors, are handed over in marriage as part of the settlement of violent feuds between families or tribes. It just highlights this vast, tragic disconnect between formal state law, which technically forbids these things, and deeply entrenched, brutal tribal practices.
And in the face of this systemic failure, the sources highlight one truly remarkable, almost heroic individual who risks everything to try and bring some measure of justice, Dr. Shamim Gul.
Dr. Shamim Gul's story is both heartbreaking and incredibly inspiring. She's described as a 58-year-old Pathan grandmother, and at the time of the source material, she was the single police surgeon for the entire vast province of Balochistan.
One person for the whole province.
One person. Her professional life consisted of traveling, often alone, often at night, usually without a reliable police escort because they were too scared or unavailable, to remote, isolated areas. Her job. To dig up and examine the often decomposing bodies of murdered women.
What specifically was her role regarding these honor killings?
She performs autopsies to determine the cause of death, obviously.
Right.
But crucially, she also documents the victim's physical state. She's examined girls who were reportedly buried alive. In cases of supposed honor killing, where the family claims the victim was killed for immoral acts, Dr. Gul often performed examinations specifically to confirm whether the victims were virgins, directly countering the family's manufactured justification for the murder.
That takes immense courage. But what's the tragic conclusion to all this bravery and effort? Does the justice system actually follow through on her findings? Sadly, no. The state system routinely fails these victims, even after Dr. Gul's work. She estimated that the 10 or 15 cases she managed to examine annually probably represented only about 5% of the actual number of women killed in honor killings across the region each year.
Only 5%.
And even more tragically, she stated that none of the cases she investigated were ever successfully prosecuted. The powerful forces of kinship loyalty, tribal honor codes, and local political patronage consistently overwhelmed the formal legal mechanisms that are supposed to protect these victims and punish the perpetrators. Her work documented the crime but couldn't ensure justice.
That really underscores the weakness of the state. It brings us to our next section, Section 4, looking at faith, force, and the future threat. Let's tackle the complexity of Islamism first. We often assume in the West that Islamist mobilization springs from sheer backwardness or poverty, but the sources argue something different, that it thrives on partially achieved modernity. What does that mean? Yeah, this is a really critical nuance that often gets missed. Islamist groups tend to find their strongest, most committed support not necessarily in the most impoverished, remote, purely traditional areas, but rather among the frustrated, urban, lower middle classes.
Why them specifically?
These are people who have gained some elements of modernity. Maybe they have some education, they have access to media, their expectations have been raised, but they face economic stagnation, blocked opportunities, social dislocation. Their frustration gets channeled through an ideology that offers a seemingly simple, clear moral framework, a sense of identity, and crucially a promise of justice and order that the often corrupt and inefficient state has clearly failed to deliver.
So why is there progress in gaining active mass support elsewhere, say, among the rural poor, generally more limited?
Well, there are a couple of reasons suggested. First, the deeply conservative nature of Pakistani society in general. But perhaps more importantly, any attempt at mobilization from below, especially radical mobilization, is often immediately stifled by the entrenched power of the existing political bosses and the incredibly strong, resilient kinship groups they lead.
How does that stifling work?
Basically, dissent gets fragmented. It gets absorbed back into the existing patronage system. Radical ideas like land reform, for instance, which you might think would be a natural platform for Islamist groups trying to appeal to the rural poor, simply fail to gain much traction in the countryside. Why? Because the landowners, the zamindars, are just too strong. They control the local biradari structure, the local administration, often the local police. They can crush dissent pretty effectively.
This internal conflict, this tension, is even visible within major Islamist parties like the Jamaat-e-Islami, JEI, when they talk about the Pakistani Taliban, right?
Oh, absolutely. The JI walks this very complex political tightrope. You have members like Syed Shahid Jalani, who's mentioned in the source, a Punjabi JI figure, who condemns the Pakistani Taliban quite harshly. He calls their actions anarchy
and insist that the writ of the state absolutely must run everywhere to prevent the country from collapsing into chaos.
But the party leadership takes a much more ambiguous stance, don't they?
Yes, very much so. Said Munawar Hassan, who was the party leader at the time the source material was gathered, pointedly refused to denounce terrorism carried out by the Taliban against fellow Muslims within Pakistan.
Why? What was his reasoning?
His political calculations seemed to be to redirect the anger outwards. He famously declared, "America is the biggest terrorist in the world." His argument was essentially that before 9/11 and the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, there was virtually no terrorism in Pakistan. So blame America. This highlights the political necessity, for him at least, of focusing on an external foreign enemy to mobilize support, rather than directly confronting internal militant groups who might actually share some similar long-term ideological goals, even if their methods differ. It avoids alienating potential sympathizers.
We also need to address that common Western misunderstanding about madrasas and terrorism. The sources pretty clearly counter the idea that these religious schools are the primary breeding ground for militants.
Yeah, the data presented is quite firm on this. A majority of known Pakistani terrorists actually attended government schools, not madrasas, and often possess higher education, sometimes university degrees.
So it points back to that urban group again.
Exactly. It points back towards those frustrated urban lower middle classes as the key ideological engine, not necessarily the impoverished, illiterate rural masses often associated with madrasas in the Western imagination. Madrasas are significant in the tribal areas, but primarily because government schools are often rare or non-functional there. They become the only available educational infrastructure by default. The sources suggest the communities in those areas would likely have supported the Taliban anyway, due to complex local factors, with or without the madrasas. It reinforces the idea that the roots of militancy are often more social and political than purely educational.
Okay, switching gears completely within the realm of faith, let's talk about the counterforce to this kind of rigid, puritanical Islamism, Sufism, and the whole culture surrounding shrines and spiritual leaders, the pirs.
Right. The cult of the saints, the pirs, these are far more than just spiritual centers. They are incredibly powerful, highly practical political institutions and massive patronage machines.
How do they function politically?
The pirs, these hereditary saints who inherit spiritual authority, use that authority and their vast network of devoted followers, murids, to gain access to political power, state resources, and protection for themselves and their followers. This network provides tangible benefits, help with jobs, disputes, navigating bureaucracy that extend deep into rural society, reinforcing their influence.
And what's really fascinating is the key role they seem to play in bridging the often violent Sunni-Shia divide in Pakistan. How does that work?
This is a crucial function. Many influential peer families, including some very prominent politically active ones like the Bhuttos and Zardaris are mentioned, are often publicly Sunni but are known to be privately Shia. Or they maintain a kind of deliberately ambiguous position somewhere in between.
So they straddle the line.
Exactly. This transcommunal nature of popular Sufism creates this unique, incredibly valuable social space that actively hinders sectarian extremism. It brings Sunnis and Shias together at the shrines in shared devotion. And this is precisely why extremists, like the Taliban and other hardline groups, view these shrines and the Sufi tradition as ideological targets. They see them as promoting heresy and undermining their puritanical version of Islam, which is why shrines have been so frequently and tragically attacked.
Can you paint a picture for us? What's the atmosphere actually like at a major shrine, like Lal Shahbaz Qalandar mentioned in the sources? What does that syncretic culture look and feel like?
Oh, the atmosphere is described as a powerful, almost overwhelming sensory explosion of devotion and culture. You see intense drumming, ecstatic dancing. There are men called malangs or dervishes, described vividly in the source as looking like thousand-year-old hippies with long matted hair and beards, stretching their arms towards heaven, lost in frenzied motion.
And the sectarian mixing is visible.
Very much so. There's often a strong Shia element evident, maybe in the chants of Ya Ali or the specific style of drumming. You also see women participating actively, many described as perhaps psychologically troubled, finding a kind of public spiritual therapy unavailable elsewhere in conservative society. They might be shaking their heads feverishly, hair unbound. And notably, the source mentions the pervasive smell of hashish often hangs in the air, signifying a deeply syncretic, relaxed, and distinctly non-puritanical form of popular Islam. It's a world away from the rigid mosques of the Islamists.
Now we turn to the final and arguably the most powerful internal pillar holding the country together, for better or worse, the military. The sources note this extreme commitment to unity and internal discipline drilled into every officer and soldier. That makes successful internal revolt almost impossible, right?
Yeah, that internal discipline is perhaps the military's defining characteristic, its genius, and its primary defense against fragmentation or coups from below. The result is that every successful military coup in Pakistan's history has been carried out by the Chief of Army Staff, backed by consensus of the powerful corps commanders, never from the lower ranks.
So attempts at coups from below just fail.
They seem to. The extreme loyalty structure, combined with very effective military intelligence, means that Islamist or other conspiracies by junior officers, and the sources confirm there have been several, are apparently swiftly penetrated, identified, and smashed before they can gain any real traction. The chain of command is held as absolutely sacrosanct.
The officer corps also seems to harbor this deep-seated contempt for the civilian political class. How does that view help sustain the military's own power and legitimacy?
Well, the military leadership is drawn primarily from the middle classes, increasingly the urban middle classes. And they genuinely seem to view themselves as morally superior, more modern, more progressive, certainly better educated, and far less corrupt than the feudal politicians they often openly disguise.
And the public buys into that.
Often, yes. This self-image, combined with their demonstrable relative efficiency in their own sphere, like managing national rescue efforts during the massive 2010 floods, which the sources mention constantly renews public admiration, especially when contrasted with the perceived corruption and incompetence of many civilian administrations. They look like the only institution that works.
However, the sources identify the military's central, perhaps tragic flaw, one that has enormous strategic and economic consequences for the entire country.
Yes, that flaw is identified as its singular, all-consuming obsession with India, and particularly the unresolved issue of Kashmir. This obsession has fundamentally defined the military's character, its budget priorities, and its entire strategic worldview right from Pakistan's inception.
And the cost.
The cost is huge. The resulting massive scale of military spending year after year, decade after decade, severely limits the funds available for absolutely crucial areas like education, healthcare, infrastructure development, water management. The sources warn that if this strategic imbalance continues, it risks sending Pakistan down the same path as the former Soviet Union, basically, a state that gets locked into a ruinous, unsustainable military competition with a vastly richer, more powerful neighbor, crippling its own development in the process.
And this obsession led directly to a fundamental political mistake by the military's intelligence wing, the ISI, stemming from their own institutional myth of success, didn't it?
Absolutely. The victory over the Soviets in the Afghan jihad of the 1980s, heavily backed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, was undeniably a monumental achievement for the ISI. It became their central institutional myth.
How so?
Because they successfully managed huge amounts of foreign funding and effectively used Islamist militants as proxies to bleed a superpower, they became convinced they could apply the exact same instrument, Islamist militants, against their main rival, India, specifically in Kashmir.
Which turned out to be a mistake.
A fundamental political and strategic mistake, according to the analysis. This decision to prioritize non-state actors, these militant groups, as a core geopolitical tool against India ended up fueling decades of internal instability within Pakistan itself. It created a massive blowback problem, empowering groups that eventually turned against the Pakistani state, destabilizing their own country in ways they clearly didn't foresee.
This fixation on India results in some truly, reckless viewpoints among senior leadership, like the strategy proposed by that neoconservative-sounding general mentioned in the source.
Yeah, the view presented by this unnamed general is articulated with a really stunning degree of, you could say, geopolitical fanaticism and recklessness. The strategy proposed is stark, almost chillingly simple.
What is it?
Basically, if India ever tries to seriously break up Pakistan, say, by substantially supporting bloc nationalists, then Pakistan's response shouldn't just be defensive. It should be to actively try and break up India in return.
How? By exploiting India's own internal problems.
Exactly. By actively supporting and exploiting India's existing internal fault lines.
Which ones did he specifically mention as targets?
He listed Kashmir, obviously, but also the Naxalite Maoist insurgency spreading across central and eastern India, the Khalistan separatist movement in Punjab, and various other caste and religious conflicts simmering across India.
And his prediction?
He claimed, quite dramatically, that India is not nearly as strong internally as it looks from the outside, and that by strategically supporting these existing insurgencies, Pakistan could potentially cause India to cease to exist. It just illustrates the extreme zero-sum, almost apocalyptic mentality that can dominate strategic thinking at the highest levels when that India obsession takes hold.
Wow. Okay, this has been an incredibly detailed deep dive. We've covered so much ground from the intimate level of the Biradari network all the way up to the mindset of generals contemplating breaking up India. Let's try and synthesize these elements as we move towards our conclusion.
Yeah, I think in summary, what emerges is a picture of the Pakistani state kind of stumbling along, perpetually caught between these deeply conflicting forces. You have the deep-rooted dominance of kinship, honor, and patronage politics, which constantly undermines effective central administration and modern governance.
Right.
This system then interacts, often toxically, with simmering regional conflicts and identities in Balochistan, among the Pathans, within the Mohajir community in the cities. And all of this plays out under the long shadow of the institutional supremacy of a military that remains dangerously fixated on an external threat, India, often at the expense of internal development and stability. It really is a nation of profound contradictions, somehow balancing deep internal dysfunction with a surprisingly powerful social resilience, rooted in those very kinship structures.
The sources, however, point to a threat that might be far more existential in the long run than political instability or ethnic disintegration. What is identified as the single greatest long-term risk?
The true long-term threat, the one that might override everything else, is identified as ecological degradation, and specifically, the escalating crisis in water resources. This lack of effective water management, driven largely by political paralysis and interprovincial mistrust, threatens to increase regional tensions to potentially unbearable levels.
How so?
It could eventually make national and even provincial governments simply unworkable, potentially rendering vast swaths of agricultural land unusable, displacing millions and fueling conflict over dwindling resources. It's a slow-burn crisis with potentially catastrophic consequences.
And the sources illustrate this perfectly with the decades-long failure to build the Calibad Dam. Why has this seemingly critical national infrastructure project been indefinitely stalled?
Right. The Calabar Dam story is tragically symbolic. For over 50 years, the idea of building a major hydroelectric dam at Calabar on the Indus River has been seen as technologically feasible and nationally necessary for both power generation and water storage. Yet, it has been perpetually blocked by fierce interprovincial political opposition.
Who opposes it and why?
Primarily, the smaller provinces, specifically Sindh downstream and the NWFP, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa upstream, deeply fear losing vital water resources to the industry and agriculture of the much larger and politically dominant province of Punjab, where the dam would be located.
So old rivalries trump national need.
Precisely. This deep-seated fear of Punjabi dominance, rooted in historical grievances, means that these regional rivalries have consistently overridden the clear national necessity for critical water and power management. It starkly highlights how deeply these old political and ethnic fault lines prevent progress on issues absolutely essential for the country's future survival.
This has been a truly masterful guide to navigating the complexities of one of the most misunderstood countries on Earth. Thank you. But if Pakistan is so chaotic internally and its formal institutions are often so flawed, what is the one overarching factor that currently seems to prevent the entire house of cards from just collapsing?
Well, that really raises the final important question for you, the listener, to consider based on everything we've explored today. Why is it that despite all these immediate dangers we've discussed, the ethnic tensions, the resource conflicts, the Taliban threat, the deeply flawed nature of its justice and political systems, perhaps the sheer fear of the alternative, the fear of complete chaos, of Yugoslavia-style civil war, the terrifying prospect of total state failure. Why might that fear be the greatest single factor currently holding Pakistan together? The internal conflict is immense, yes, but maybe, just maybe, the prospect of utter collapse is still seen by most as even worse than the incredibly difficult status quo. Something to think about.